folks, welcome to Thunder Mesa Studio and part 4 of our Calico mountain build. In this episode, we'll be finishing up the track and wiring on the On18 levels and hopefully even getting some trains running up there. That's right, I said levels, as in more than one. Since we last checked in, I've decided to modify my original plan by adding a second On18 level about halfway up between the On30 deck and the upper figure 8. Here I've mocked up this simple loop with some foam core to make sure it would actually fit. Sometimes it's hard to tell from a 2D drawing what will fit and what won't. And during construction, I often find that there's room for improvements that I hadn't thought of before. Another small change that I've made is to drop in a new turnout down here on the On30 level. The route doesn't go anywhere yet, but I thought it might be a good idea to build in the possibility of a branch line extension somewhere down the road. As you can see, I've already made a start laying the On18 track on the top level. And now I'll finish that up before replacing this foam core with more plywood roadbed.
I like to use Pico Hon30 Flex track to represent On18, but unfortunately it's become rather hard to find here in the States recently. I finally found a supplier in the UK that was able to ship me some without charging an arm and a leg. The shop is called Hatton's Model Trains, and I'll put a link to their website in the video description below. It's worth noting that what we call HON30 in the US is known as HOE in most of Europe and 009 in the UK, but it's all the same 9mm gauge track. It has larger ties than you'll find on 9mm gauge N-scale track, and they're sized and spaced to represent narrow gauge. And though the track is scaled for HO, it also works very well visually for On18. For the new middle level, I used my foam core mock-up to determine the placement for risers, then replaced it with plywood roadbed. The hidden backstretch of the middle loop was completed at the workbench and then slid into place. Then the rest of the route was installed. N-scale cork roadbed was glued down, and 1/8 inch MDF bridge decks were glued in place, just as was done for the upper figure 8 route.
Okay, let the glue dry on all this and then I can finish laying that On18 track.
The cork roadbed was sanded down nice and smooth, and then everything was cleaned up for final track laying.
Now, to install the On18 track, I'm using exactly the same techniques that I used on the On30 down below, just a little smaller, using slightly smaller spikes. On the curves, I'm spiking them about every 4th tie, and on the straight sections, about every 8th tie. Easy peasy. Now, even though I'm soldering the rails on the curves, it's important to have as few joints as possible going around the curves like this, especially in a really sharp curve. These are 9-inch radius curves, which is about as sharp as you can get away with. So I try to keep the joints on either side on the far ends of the curves and not out here in the middle where they might be a little bit problematic, even with the rail soldered.
Once again, I soldered the rail joints only where they led into curves and left the straight sections unsoldered to allow for seasonal expansion and contraction of the nickel-silver rail. I used a pin vise and a number 74 twist bit to drill pilot holes for micro-engineering small rail spikes. These spikes are pretty delicate, and the pilot holes kept them from bending or breaking when driven down into the plywood. Once the track laying was done, I used a Bright Boy rail cleaner to scrub any leftover soldering flux from the tops of the rails, and then went back and glued leftover ties under the rail joints where they had been previously removed.
Now with the track all laid, the next step will be to drop some feeder wires down and bring power to these tracks. But before I do that, I want to take a minute to talk about how the On18 lines are going to be powered. On the On30 Thunder Mesa layout, the trains are run with digital command control, DCC for short, and I use an NCE system to do that. For the On18, I'm going with straight DC. And the reason for that is this is not the main railroad. This is to add some kinetic energy and visual interest to the main railroad. Now I know there's probably plenty of room inside these little On18 critters to put in an N-scale decoder, maybe even sound if you wanted to do that. And if this was my main layout, my main focus, I would probably do that. But since it's there just in a supporting role, DC is reliable and works fine. And I just happen to have several of these old DC power packs like this one to bring power to these tracks.
I soldered 28 gauge solid core feeder wires to the rails to bring track power. For such short loops, it was only necessary to connect one set of wires for each On18 level.
Both of the On18 levels would be controlled from backstage here. I built this shelf on the back of the layout to hold the two DC throttle packs. Now each throttle powers one of the two levels. I've slanted the shelf at a 45-degree angle because space is at a premium back here. I've also left a little extra space for other components to be added in the future. Okay, I've got everything hooked up. Here goes nothing. Man, I love it when a plan comes together. Well, so far so good. Now that I have the On18 track finished, I can start thinking about roughing in the scenery. And that's what I'll be doing in part 5 of this series coming up real soon. But that's going to do it for this time. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. I really appreciate it. Adios for now.